Eva Burrows had on his life, and that could be echoed around this room and around the Salvation Army world, because Eva had that ability that whoever she was talking to, you were the person she was most concerned about. And that's an extraordinary gift. But it went deeper than that. There was a practical dimension to that as well. Let me give you one brief anecdote that just occurred recently with this woman in the weeks before she died. I was preparing something for the International Congress, and it was a project that the General had been pestering me to do for a number of years. It was about the history of the Salvation Army and the film industry. And I said to her, look, I'd love you to do a little sort of introduction to this piece. And she said, yes, by all means, we'll do that. And we go to the old Limelight Studios at 69 Burke Street in Melbourne, and we're up there. And I'd written a script for her. Because, you know, she's getting on a bit. I thought we'll make this easy and we'll have it up on an auto cue. And we're doing the auto cue with the script and she's not getting it right. And we're on for an hour and she said, no, I'm going to get this right. And I'm thinking, no, this is not going to work. Then she tells me, after an hour of this, that she's actually gone blind in one eye. And she's been trying to make it easier for us to do this by pretending that she wasn't blind in one eye. And I said, General, I'll get rid of the auto cue, just wing it. You're quite capable. But she was so concerned to actually make it easy for you. Then a week or so later, I'm talking to her on the phone and she said, this is a very interesting story. I said, what's more interesting, I said, is many of the old people who were in this Salvation Army movie industry stuff worldwide, in England, in America, in Australia and elsewhere, strangely enough, over the 20 years that followed the closure of the Limelight Department, the Army's film company, in 1910, a lot of them drifted into other companies that eventually became part of 20th Century Fox. And 20th Century Fox, as many of you know, is owned by Rupert Murdoch. And she says, oh, Rupert's a friend of mine. I said, yes, I have to know that. She said, would it help if we wrote something to him? I said, well, yes, that could be very reasonable. Very reasonable. You know, I'm seeing the dollar signs clink down my eyes. And she said, look, I tell you this. She said, why don't I write the first paragraph and I write the last paragraph and you write the rest? It never happened. 3 weeks later, she passed on. But that's an example of a woman who was sharp, intent, right up until the end. But my story, repeated by Brendan, could be repeated, I think, by hundreds of people. There's an example of the sort of person who genuinely gave themselves to others. That's why she was at 614. And why I think she's going to remain that person for so many of us for so many years to come. That is just an indelible imprint on your soul, really. And here's the Boundless Congress that has just taken, I'll go back one, in London. I don't know how many of you got to it. It was a super event. A super event. Every one of these mega arena events were just flawless. But for many of us, it begged a whole lot of questions. In fact, I only went to one session where any questions were asked or even considered. Yet at the very first evening that I was at the Boundless Congress, I went to a pre-Congress meeting of the Salvation Army Historical Society, and the very opening line by the first person to stand up and introduce the first speaker said, opening words, we all realise the Salvation Army is going through something of an identity crisis. And I thought, ripper, Boris, this'll be good. Never heard another word from the beginning to the end of the Congress. Now, I didn't mind any of this. But it was really like going through one of those highly scripted, highly organised, super commercial arena spectaculars where every single word is scripted. So that by the time you get to the end of it, you think, Oh yeah, here we go. Same, I know what the emotional roller coaster I'm going to be on here is for this. Now, I think for lots and lots of people it was wonderful, don't get me wrong. But I do think that first opening question on that first night was never answered and never even taken seriously. Because all of us in this room are here because we know that we're actually struggling with who we are and what we are and where we are. So let me say I admire the people who put this together, but there were certain things that didn't happen. I mean, this is just spectacular stuff. And it was quite extraordinary. And it was international. Like it wasn't just, you know, the Americans and the Brits who had their moment in the sun. They tried to do the right thing by everyone. Now, that's the Japanese sort of little intro. Now, let me take you back. That's 101 years ago. That is the Salvation Army International Congress, 1914. The theme, the world for God, the global Jesus. That's a lantern slide. Now, between that Congress and this Congress, I'm thinking, well, certain things have changed, but in some ways nothing has changed. We can do the spectacular really well. We can bang the drums, we can blow the trumpets, we can play the cymbals. But I wanted to make some observations now between the army and its vision then and the questions we're asking now. Because as somebody who's got an interest in these things, one of the things that I noticed from the 1904 Congress and the 1914 Congress was they had councils for officers and soldiers and lay people in which they asked serious questions. I've got some notes from the 1904 Congress where William Booth talks seriously about the Salvation Army and the native peoples of the world. That is, how we should deal with Aboriginal people in Australia, how we should deal with Native Americans. They were sophisticated questions. Perhaps one of the things is we've lost the ability to ask those and organise those questions for ourselves these days. That's just one of the observations I'd like to make. Christianity in the West generally has gone through, and we all know, a period of 50 years of what are we doing? It's not just a question for the Salvation Army. Religion is in decline, and I think it is essentially about a crisis of relevance. And it's not just for the army. The crisis of relevance is people are saying, yeah, you can go to church on Sunday, but you're not talking to me. I'm out here in the street and there's nothing going on. The difference between today and then, and this is stuff I touched on yesterday, is that the church 100 years ago was far more embedded in the world, and it wasn't just the army. The church saw itself as having a place, a legitimate place at the table in civil society. What I also said yesterday is over the past 100 years, for most of the 20th century, all churches have been in a process of withdrawal. And those withdrawals took us into our own private closed communities where we were all very happy until about 1965, 1966, when television and electronic media began to break down those walls, and kids growing up from 1956 on had alternatives to those closed little worlds. Like, I'm one of the few kids, I think probably Dave Eldridge is the only other one in the room at the moment, and maybe one or two others, who can remember growing up in a world pre-television, where your whole world, a few willing hands up, I see 2 or 3. I was at a conference for the Catholic Church 2 weeks ago, and this same question came up. What's happened? And they used a word that I used yesterday, that what was once called by German sociologist Gemeinschaft, that is the closed community, is dead. We haven't, and all churches are suffering from it. It's no longer the pastor, the school teacher and your parents. It's the television, it's Facebook, it's Twitter, it's whatever. Kids are in a globalised world from the moment they can pick up an iPad. I mean, it's different. It's different. You can't do junior soldiers training and directory class anymore and expect that kid to believe that's the whole world. The Catholic Church can't do catechetics with its kids anymore and pretend that's the whole world. So let's not blame ourselves here. The world has changed. So there are some things that it's not that we're doing wrong, it's that the world has shifted. How do we adjust ourselves to it? Is the question. I want to suggest we've all been here before, particularly for the Salvation Army. Here's the Salvation. Can we turn the volume up a bit? Thanks. No? Some of you may have seen this before. Every one of those posters and that song were all about the Salvation Army. And they were all the product of Hollywood between 1896 and 1950. People, the world, loved the Salvation Army. Why? Did they love us because we were a church? Funny about that. What are we these days? What are we these days? What do we train our officers to be? Priests. Oh, that's another topic. This is the image of the Salvation Army that dominated those 50 years of Hollywood. That's the first American actress ever to commercially play a Salvation Army officer on stage. Her name was Edna May, and she starred in what now is regarded by music historians as the first modern stage musical. It was called The Belle of New York, written in 1896 and performed on stage in London and the United States to great crowds for a best part of a couple of years. The Belle of New York. Guess what? It was the story of a Salvation Army lass going out and winning her straying boyfriend back to the Lord. That image bore on a reality. That's Evangeline Booth, who became general. That's a Salvation Army publicity poster from around 1904, 1905. People believed and saw that was true. That was the image of the Salvation Army that was deep in people's psyche. And why did it work? It's because it's extraordinarily radical. Why is that radical? Can anybody tell me? It's a woman leading a global religion organisation. Well, she wasn't. She was leading the Salvation Army in America then. But she is also, for those with a sort of Catholic sensibility, that's the Virgin Mary. This is Evangeline in blue. Blue is the colour associated with Mary, protection, the mother. This is not a dumbly constructed image. People were smart in putting this image together. So smart that in fact, within a few years, that image had become the Salvation Army's national publicity campaign poster for 1917. But look at the phrase that accompanies it. A man may be down, but he's never out. For people who want to argue that the Salvation Army took off because we were a successful evangelical movement, using evangelical in the words, bring them into the room, preach the gospel to them, get them kneeling at the mercy seat and saved, I say half true. Lots of other groups were trying to do that and had been doing it for 60 years. The difference with the Salvation Army was it said, no, that's half the story. The real story is what's happening to people out there. And unless we demonstrate who Jesus is, then why should they believe us? People loved the Salvation Army because we didn't do this first, we did that first. That's why the Salvation Army worked. We're going through a crisis of relevance for the churches today. I want to suggest that if we look and learn anything from our history, it's that people respect and still respect. You watch any television news bulletin, they love to have a go at churches, but they still love to go and see a group of church people looking after the poor, doing the coffee run, doing that. That still works. Why? Not because it's publicity, it's because it's true. It's true. We've got an age of television commercial salesmanship which makes the preach first model, which every ad on every television station is doing, totally counterproductive. What people are after is authenticity of action, not words. So I'm not saying don't preach, but I am echoing St. Francis when he went off to see, during one of the Crusades, went off to meet the Muslim leader, and somebody challenged him about preaching, and he said, yes, I preach every day and sometimes, occasionally, I use words. Great line. This image still retains power in the public mind. That photo, Salvation Army, that's during 9/11. The figures beside it are quoted off PBS television in the United States for a few years later, Hurricane Katrina. That's how many meals a week and beds the Salvation Army pumped out during Hurricane Katrina in the United States. The Salvation Army was one of the few organisations able to mobilise itself in New Orleans because the Americans had been busy deconstructing civil society for 20 years. And the great criticism of what happened after Hurricane Katrina is the government agencies failed. Why? Because they'd had the guts ripped out of them. The Salvation Army was seen on the front of public sector television, Time magazine and others as one of the few agencies that retained the capacity to get there and do it. So, second point about the Salvation Army, it retains an organisation that is structured locally, nationally, globally, and can respond. That's another insight that goes back to that 1914 Congress and the picture of the world. In those days, the Salvation Army's picture of the world wasn't a metaphorical one. Oh, we'd like to see the world for King Jesus. No, they said, we're a globally structured organisation. We can tell from IHQ that if there's an officer who's got ability in London in the East End who's needed in Melbourne, we'll send him there. And they did it. The number 3 lesson, the military model was not a metaphor. It is not a metaphor. It was a structured reality. The Salvation Army deliberately broke 1,500 years of church ecclesiology and structure and said, no, we need to adjust ourselves to a globalised world. Guess what? 2015, what's on everybody's mind every day? Globalisation. Guess what we were created for? Globalisation. We were created for globalisation. Out of this situation is London in the East End, 1870. It's now being replicated around the world. Inequality is growing. Economists tell us, and they're right, that global GDP, that's gross national product, is growing around the world. Less people are in absolute poverty now than they ever were. True. The problem is that when you mine down in the figures, that money is actually not being equitably distributed. The rich are getting very much richer, and in many, many cases the poor are getting poorer, including in countries that are part of the rich West. In the United States, income for ordinary people hasn't moved for 40 years, while income for the top 10% has gone up about 300%. So we are watching radical redistribution of income, and a number of sociologists say if you want to look at what's happening at ISIS and the Middle East, remember to include economics, because you're dealing with people who have been left in abject poverty and misery for 50, 60 years. They are angry. And if they want to use religion as a tool to focus their anger, they will use it. We were created for such a time as this. And this is going to be the field in which we are able to work increasingly over the next 20 years. We know here in Ingle Farm from government projections that with the collapse of the auto industry, manufacturing industry, there are going to be hard times in South Australia, particularly in the northern suburbs of Adelaide. Has the Salvation Army yet had a strategic meeting about how it's going to cope and handle that? Yes. Great. That is terrific, because it begins to talk to us about the way we need to deal with this world. William Booth and Catherine Booth were products of their time, but what they were sensitive to was the world outside of them. And this is the next point that I think is really significant. The Salvation Army was born to break down the pastoral model of church. Yet most of our training colleges these days have spent 50 years training officers to be pastors. That is, on congregational maintenance. We weren't created as an organisation for congregational maintenance. That's why so many of the things that hang off us, like uniforms and stuff, just don't fit. And is it any wonder you got kids saying, why should I be a soldier and wear a funny uniform? All I do is come and sit in the church on Sunday and go to a Bible study. My friends in the Baptist church do that. They don't have to sign up for abstinence. They don't have to signing their lives away. I've got to say, yep, you're right. Because we have by default drifted into being local churches in local communities with some particularly quaint bits and pieces of culture that you have to have particular tastes to enjoy. Now, I'm one of those who has those particular tastes. Like, I'm a brass band nut. But I recognise that other people aren't, and it takes a deal of unpacking to explain to my colleagues at work why I am. And they're from other Christian traditions. The Salvation Army's musical culture was created as a practical example of contemporary relevance at the time. At the time. Now, I'm not going to bag the musical culture. I'll say more about that later. The other point that comes through this is that the Salvation Army had an understanding of the world that was outward first, inward second. And Catherine Booth is the other example of that. Catherine stand on the right of women to preach. We've got an argument, and I'm not going to come down on one side or the other, but there's an argument going on in the church about how you handle the whole gay issue. It's a difficult one. It's got to be worked through. But let me tell you, the injunctions against women in the Bible are as strong, or perhaps even more strong, according to some people, than the injunctions against gays. I'm not telling you how we come down on that issue, but I am saying the Salvation Army is prepared to struggle and make decisions on those issues, sometimes in advance of where other people are. It took the United States till 1920 to give women the vote, and in England. I mean, the Salvation Army is 40 years ahead in those areas. Where Paul says, women in church, pretty careful. Paul had some pretty strong words to say about women. Some people might even call him a misogynist. Far be it from me. But, you know, we have been here before. Not the same issue, but similar issues. Here's the Articles of War. Here's the Articles of War. Every Salvation Army soldier signs one, or a variant. I signed an earlier variant of this, as some of you in the room did, and this may have been updated since. But the point I want to make is this. Why should kids be soldiers in the Salvation Army? I find it very difficult to give them a good answer at the moment. I do. Because I actually believe in soldiership. I'm a great supporter of soldiership. But soldiership is saying to people, we want you to commit yourselves to a task. Soldiership is not membership. We've come to regard it as membership, a bit like, a Jewish kid does his bar mitzvah or a Catholic kid does First Communion. That's soldiership for us. No, it's not. No, it's not. Soldiership is not membership of the church. Read the Articles of War. What does it say? Having accepted Jesus Christ as my Saviour and Lord and desiring to fulfil my membership in his church, that is, I'm already now a member of the church, as a soldier in the Salvation Army. That is, soldiership is something you do after being a member of the church. Repent, believe, be born again brings you into the community of the church. Soldiership is a commitment, a bit softer these days than it was. If you read an early Articles of War, you'll take it seriously. But let me give you a practical example. If you want kids want to sign up, you know that, you work with them. They love being part of something. But that being part of something these days has a couple of different elements. One, it's got to be real. That is, show me what it is. I'm not going to stand for any bull dust. And the other is, it's going to be conditional. That is, I'll do it so long as it works. But don't ask me to sign up for life, because I just may decide that you're not doing what you say you're going to do, and I'm not going to be part of that. Salvation Army soldiership needs to take a look at what we are asking people to do. We actually need to provide them more than just coming and sitting on the seat. Now, you say, oh, that's difficult. There's projects and I just don't know. I can't get people to sign up for that. Look, I'll give you one simple example. What about you take the idea that, we plan giving, and you plan, and everyone comes around, we gather around, we pray about it, and we say, I'm going to commit X amount of my income per year to the work of the Salvation Army. Great, terrific. What about as part of the Soldiers' Covenant, every officer has the ability to say, okay, I want you here, when you sign up every year, we'll have soldiers renewal, and you'll commit to X amount of your hours per week to the Salvation Army. I'm not asking you what to sign up for. I'm just saying I want to know, as the commanding officer of this corps, that I have this resource of money available and this resource of time available. It's not a hard ask. It's easy to do. That is a fact. That's the beginning of practical engagement of your layperson, of giving soldiers a meaning, of giving soldiership a meaning. What's another way of giving soldiership a meaning? Well, try this one. The Salvation Army used to collect statistics. I grew up in the Salvation Army, and some of you still remember it, where one of the onerous jobs of the Sergeant Major every Sunday night, and in our corps, he was a double B player. He used to sit at the back of the band, and on Sunday nights, he'd be sitting there with a writing pad. And he'd be filling out the weekly attendance forms for every section in the corps. And they'd go into headquarters. And headquarters had these vast piles of statistics about everything that went on in every single corps around the world. This is pre-computer. Pre-computer. The tragedy is that a statistical resource like that could be a unique resource for understanding the way the Salvation Army has grown and developed and changed over a century, because that's how long they were kept. The trouble is, around the 1970s, officers began to say, and headquarters began to say, oh, look, yeah, sorry, I didn't do the stats this week. And gradually, they never got kept away. And some got lost, and eventually the whole system fell apart. If we'd only been able to wait another 10 years and pull that stuff together, we could have had a resource that actually helps shape who and what we are. But all is not lost. William Booth understood that stats are a really useful tool. What about this? Facebook these days. I heard this morning on the radio that Facebook is now going to basically be able to buy in to these mega data agencies that are storing every little bit of stuff you do, so that they are going to be feeding you on Facebook all the stuff that you'd like to do based on their analysis of mega data collection around the world, bought from some of the mega data agencies that can tell you when you shopped, where you travelled, how long you took to get there, what your kids were eating for lunch, the whole lot. That's coming up as a Facebook offering. That is very sophisticated. What about the army? It does for something very simple, like say, one of the things we'd like to know about soldiership is every 3 years we are going to ask Corps, every soldier in every Corps, to fill out a skills audit. And that will be fed into the division, fed into the territory, fed in internationally. So around the world, the Salvation Army instantly on a computer database can know the skills of every single soldier according to categories, and if needed be, can say, look, we need X things done here and we know where these soldiers are, and you just send out a bunch of emails to 4,000 soldiers around the world who have particular skills in computer data analysis saying, we need 5 of you to do a project in Zambia for us. I bet you'd get 5 pretty quick. I mean, we've got it. We have the capacity to do what other churches don't in all the areas that churches talk about doing things. We've got it, and we've got the structures to facilitate it. And we've got the rationale to do it. We've got a thing called soldiership, which mobilises the laity. And this is where the observation about ordination comes in. In 1978, General Arnold Brown, for whatever reason, took a decision that Salvation Army officers should now be ordained like local ministers. My problem with that is that it turns on its head 2 things. One, the Salvation Army and its theology and doctrines about the priesthood of all believers, which is a fundamental Wesleyan perspective that Booth took into the Salvation Army. The second part is it kills soldiership straight away. Because if the officer is now, in effect, the sacramental priesthood, because that's what ordination means, the sacred order of the priesthood of Melchizedek, believe me, what does that do to the sacramental role of the soldier? It reduces the soldier to the recipient. Bless me if you can. What? Me, mate? No, I'm only in the band. I don't do that stuff. It destroys the theological and doctrinal basis of soldiership. No wonder your soldiers have been passive recipients for 30 years. It's all they've been allowed to be, theologically. Now, I'm not criticising officers for this, because I know many officers around the world were profoundly disturbed by that change, particularly when it seemed to drop out of outer space. I can also understand why it was done. The army had grown up through the 1950s and the spread of the ecumenical movement around the world, and everybody was into cooperation with other churches. Terrific, nothing wrong with that, except that other churches were saying to the Salvation Army, your practices when it comes to sacramental observance aren't quite right. Now, the Salvation Army drew the line and said, well, we're not going to introduce communion, but all right, we'll introduce ordination for officers. Made life pretty good for some officers who can now join the local ministers' fraternal and feel that they could talk to the local bishop and perhaps even be invited around for a cup of tea. But what did it do for our mission? What did it do for our mission? I think it had a profoundly stultifying effect, because it turns us back into being passive congregation, active officer. He's the officer, he does the job. She's the officer, she does the job. Sergeant Majors used to be, in the early days of the army, the key operative. Officers were changed every 7 months. The Corps was built around the Sergeant Major and the Corps locals. I'm going to skip over a few slides here. Excuse me. That's an example of women's practical officership work, but I want to skip on. And there's women in leadership again. I had lots of illustrations of these things. You don't need them. Women, again, in Australia, out in the front, as Brendan's covered this, the role of women in doing things. Our social institutions, that there is the Anchorage in Melbourne, a beautiful old building opened by Alfred Deakin and Herbert Booth for the Salvation Army. It's gone now, it's not in army possession. What that was an example of the way we used our social work and integrated it into our other work. that the descendant of the anchorage is Salvos stores. But what used to happen at the anchorage, it was part of the army's whole recycling of the world and its goods. It was about recycling goods and people, because what you put together in the anchorage was out of work men, waste products collected around the community and rebuilt into toys and other stuff to be distributed for kids at Christmas time. That's smart thinking. That really is smart thinking. And out of that came, eventually it descended into what's now, not descended, but morphed into what now is Salvo stores. And we don't do that bringing together of the person with the community need to do some rebuilding of the person as well as serving community need. These are examples that were really, even today, would be considered there's, your typical Salvo stores today. I was going to go over some of the aspects of this, but I won't, because we talked about it yesterday, and Stead's contribution to a lot of this stuff. Please forgive me. But the Darkest England scheme was an example of the Salvation Army taking itself globally seriously. And this is another thing about the army that I think is problematic today. Under the pressures of the 1960s, and particularly see it with people like General John Gowans, the army began to say we need to give more power not to international headquarters, but to give it to local territories. So local territorial commanders basically said to IHQ, sorry, we're not going to do that, had the capacity to do it. Now you're getting to a situation where, dare I say it, and present company accepted, some DCs may be saying to headquarters, sorry, we're not going to do that, we don't do that way in our division. Or, dare I say, local corps officers are even emboldened to say to their DCs, sorry, no, we're not going to do that around here. Now, there is a balance between authoritarian control and local autonomy. What we're risking if we pass out control locally totally is we lose the capacity to be what our DNA commanded us to be. That is a globally coherent movement to serve a globalised world. We're making ourselves like the very sort of church that William Booth walked away from. William Booth rejected the Calvinist idea that the church is only the local community gathered together. William Booth was a connectionalist. He believed that the church was a universal body. We wrote songs about it in the early days. There was a wonderful old Salvation Army song called From the General Down to Me. That is, I am a Salvationist. I am got as much connection to the general as any officer or any colonel or major has. We had an understanding of ourselves as globally coherent. We now risk the Salvation Army balkanising itself. By balkanising, I mean just turning into local groups scattered around the world who may cooperate if they feel like it. If they feel like it. James Barker was somebody who helped shape in practice as Australian commander the Darkest England scheme. I won't go into that either because I want to hurry on with this. I think I've made most of the points I want to make. I was just going to give some examples from Australia about how a lot of this stuff was actually shaped in Australia. This is the great Barker quote that everybody should remember. When he left Australia, he said this: by all means aim to reach heaven, but be like Jesus. Take a thief with you. It's a great quote, great quote. Now, Booth then said, is this just up to us? Is it this personal salvation stuff? He'd worked through it between 1883 and the Maiden Tribute campaign and 1891 and the Darkest England scheme. He comes to say this: while recognising that the primary responsibility must always rest upon the individual, we may fairly insist that society, which has by its habits, its customs and its laws greased the slope down which these poor creatures slide to perdition, shall seriously take in hand their salvation. That is, we've got to be involved in social reform. We've got to encourage governments and others to take up the rest of responsibilities. William Booth. This is Salvation Army ground theology. So you've got to say, and I'll leave that picture there for a moment, because here I've probably said enough. I'm going to finish in a second. How did we drift away from all of that? I touched on it yesterday. What happened, particularly in a period between the American Civil War and the First World War? People lost confidence in the project that the church could transform the world physically. And you can see it best in the First World War. It was devastating. So some churches moved off into what they call premillennial theology. That is, that God's only interested in rescuing us out of this doomed world and putting us in the heavenly lifeboat. And that's the job of the church. Salvation Army never bought into that theology. The Salvation Army held on to the earlier evangelical theology that no, God loves the world and God sent Jesus. It's John 3:16. God so loved the world that he sent his son. And the tag of the next verse, not to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. And premillennialists for 60 years ran off saying God's going to condemn the world. Sorry, that's not in the Bible. It's not in the Bible. Yet evangelical theology got swept with this because of what they saw out of the First World War. The army didn't. But what the army did do, and I think this is both a strength and a weakness, the army retreated into its own culture. The army insulated and inoculated itself by creating this wondrous culture, of which I'm a product and so many others are. It was fantastic because it kept hold of that old Wesleyan tradition. And even as core drifted away in the 50s and 60s, being influenced by radio and television preachers on premillennialism, we still had our organisational roots tied to our social work and other things. So by the time we get to the 1970s and 1980s, people are saying, hang on, our core and our social work has drifted a long way apart. It's not entirely our fault, folks. There were stresses that were forcing that upon us, including the inclusive professionalisation of social work. But we've got to say, oh, and one other point I'd make about the music. I want to say we still owe a debt to Salvation Army music. We had, in 1965, when the Beatles were hitting the headlines, we had the Salvation Army prepared to go out there and hit the headlines with contemporary music as well, with groups like the Joy Strings. They were up there in the major music magazines of the world, treated seriously as a pop group. If you want to hear them today, you'd equate them to the Australian group The Seekers. That's where they fitted in the sort of pop culture of the day. A bit like The Seekers. And The Seekers were a world hit. But what the Salvation Army retained in its transition into that music, you listen to some of the songs of Joy Webb, and you listen to the songs of the Australian Howard Davies from that same era, and the difference they had between what they were writing as pop music and what came out of, and much later, 10 years later, out of the churches as Christian pop music, as worlds apart. And it's not the musical style, it's the lyrics. Church popular culture bought into American popular culture, which was all about me. And I am sick to death of singing Coca-Cola commercials for Jesus or Jesus is my boyfriend. I am sick of it. I'm one of those who pushed for contemporary music in the Salvation Army. I was one of those part of a group called Solid Rock many years ago. But do you know what the key was about, even up until the 60s and 70s with the writings of Joy Webb and Howard Davies? What the difference was? It wasn't sugar massage and Jesus is going to make it all nice. It was the world has pain in it. And the heart of the Salvation Army message still in its music. If you listen to the old brass band stuff of Eric Ball or Ray Steadman Allen, or you listen to their Sunday night selections if you've got the time, there's pain in that music. There's pain in that journey. I don't hear that in contemporary Christian music. I just hear Jesus is my life coach. Or Jesus is going to enable me to celebrate. I worship you. Well, yeah, how? By saying I worship you. No, that's not what the Bible says. It's not what the Salvation Army says in its music. So I don't want to trash that internal culture of the Salvation Army because it still says some stuff that's wrong, that's terrific. What's wrong is that we've lost confidence in expressing it ourselves. We've lost confidence because we've lost the understanding of who and what we are. Now, I had a couple of illustrations there pretty cheekily of the other thing about the contemporary Christian scene is it seems to drift with the winds. And Brian Houston of Hillsong, I describe Hillsong as Salvation Army light because Hillsong is all that celebratory culture that the Salvation Army had, but none of the cost, none of the hard stuff. Brian Houston even got tempted into the heresy of the prosperity gospel. He wrote a book called You Need More Money. You're writing that for a Christian? You need more money? The other thing about the Salvation Army is we do have a coherent Wesleyan biblical theology that traces itself back. So there are strong theological roots to what we do. It's not sort of, come and try a new theological variety that I think is going to make it worse. It's not, what is it called? Healing Stream? Is that the latest one? Is it Healing Stream? Is that the... Cleansing Stream, yes. I want to tell you that Cleansing Stream comes out of a very sus and not theologically deep American prosperity gospel-based theology. There is stuff floating around in the market that the Salvation Army, rightly taught, because of the doctrines and our depth in history, can actually protect us from or save us from. The reason I have that guy's face up there is that's John Nelson Darby, the guy who invented premillennial theology. And he looks a bit like the devil incarnate, doesn't he? I'm going to conclude now. What I want to say is I am optimistic for the Salvation Army, because if you look at our heritage and you scratch the surface, we were designed to fit a culture going through major transition, a culture looking at new innovative technologies, a culture where the rich and the poor, the gaps were spreading, a culture where social societies were breaking down because of isolation and it's all there. What it means, though, is us re-examining, not junking, but refreshing what we have. And you see that when you see people like Eva Burrows retiring as general, going for a couple of years to a nice middle-class call like Camberwell in Melbourne, and I've got some great friends at Camberwell. I don't diss anything that they are doing in Melbourne, but Eva Burrows saying, this is not who we are. This is not who I am. And Eva Burrows says, I'm going into 69 Burke Street, which is a struggling operation, and I'm going to support Brendan. The general of the Salvation Army did that. The top end of town does have the message, folks. It's about us at the bottom helping push it through. And perhaps I'd finish there, right? Because I'm very optimistic about the capacity of the Salvation Army to serve the world today. Thank you.